Hey guys, how you doing? This is Mike McCormick coming back to you from Advanced Criminology in Owings Mills. This is going to be part 3 of a series of videos that we're putting together dealing with the Baltimore Police Department and in connection with Freddie Gray. Today's video, though, is kind of a backdrop that I'm producing here. This particular video deals strictly today with police corruption and misconduct in the Baltimore City Police Department. And those of you who aren't familiar with the Department of Justice's report that came out last year, actually the beginning of this year, the report was a scathing report, well over 100 pages or so, close to 200 pages actually, of just an enormous amount of corruption issues, an enormous amount of misconduct issues. For a department this size, no more than 3,500 sworn members, probably actual 1,500 members in patrol, you know, roughly several hundred members working in criminal investigation division, and then you have a couple other specialized units out there. So it being the 8th largest police department, they have an enormous amount of issues to deal with and to confront. There seems to be a systemic culture where misconduct and corruption have been not investigated properly. People have been, officers have been basically, some officers have been promoted. Some officers have gone to jail. Some officers were slapped on the hands and were given reassignments elsewhere. And then there are those cases that came to the attention of the public where some officers were sued, and the Baltimore City Police Department, as well as the city of Baltimore, was sued to the tune of almost $12 million over the past several years. Today, I want to focus again on police corruption and misconduct. And I think what I want to do is I'm going to go to a definition. Because what happens oftentimes is that members of the public don't really understand the difference between police corruption and misconduct. So I'm going to give it to you straight. Police misconduct and corruption are abuses of police authority. Sometimes used interchangeably, the term refers to a wide range of procedural, criminal, and civil violations. Misconduct is the broadest category. Misconduct is procedural when it refers to police who violate police department rules and regulations, and is criminal when it refers to police who violate state and federal laws. Unconstitutional when it refers to police who violate a citizen's civil rights or any combination thereof. Common forms of misconduct are excessive force and excessive use of physical or deadly force, discriminatory arrest, physical or verbal harassment, and selective enforcement of the law. The Department of Justice report that I just talked about, everything I just read, they were able to touch on each and every aspect of police corruption and misconduct that I just read the definition of when they did their investigation with the Baltimore City Police Department. And additionally, which is important to know, there are 18,000 police departments within the United States. All of them at some point collect federal money to run their departments. So additionally, federal law prohibits discrimination in police work. Any police department receiving federal funding is covered by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in the Code 42, United States Code, subsection 2000D, and the Office of Justice Program Statute 42 U.S.C., subsection 3789D, small c, which prohibit discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, sex, or religion. These laws prohibit conduct ranging from racial slurs and unjustified arrest to the refusal of departments to respond to discrimination complaints. I'll leave it there. I think that's pretty specific as to giving you a background and what the definitions are. Many of us don't know. And so it's my job to educate those folks who don't know. Now, what I want to do also is do this. Since we're talking about police corruption and misconduct within the Baltimore Police Department, I wanted to touch on some cases. Now, I'm just going to give you an overview of some potentially noteworthy cases since 2000 within the Baltimore Police Department. And as I read these off, these things will, those of you who are familiar with some of the cases, those of you who remembered some of the names that I'm going to read off and some of the incidences that occurred, this is just a refresher for you. For those of you who don't know, certainly you will be informed after, I read these off. So let's start with in 2000. There was former Police Commissioner Ed Norris who was indicted on 3 charges by the U.S. Attorney. 2 counts charged Norris had made illegal personal expenditures from the Baltimore Police Department's supplemental account. The 3rd count alleged that he lied on a mortgage application, stating that approximately $9,000 he received from his father was not a gift, as was stated in the loan purposes, but a loan. As part of a plea agreement in 2004, Mr. Norris pled guilty to the first 2 counts and was sentenced to 6 months in federal prison, 6 months home detention, 500 hours of community service, which Judge Dick Bennett said must be served in Baltimore. The plea bargain also avoided, Commissioner Norris avoided a 30-year sentence on mortgage fraud alone. So that was the first, okay? Then there was a Flex Squad scandal. There's a high rash of corruption and brutality allegations surfaced in late 2005 and early as 2006, including the suspension and arrest of Southwestern District Flex officers for the alleged rape of a 22-year-old woman that they had taken into custody for illegal possession of narcotics. All criminal charges against the officers have since been dropped. However, stories surfaced about the Flex Squad officers planting evidence on citizens. Murder charges were dropped by the city when it was revealed that a gunman was dropped off in a rival gang territory after the police interrogation in the squad. The man was beaten badly and exacted his revenge the next day. The squad's role in the shooting prompted the state's attorney, at that time, Patricia Jessamy, to drop the charges. 2005, Detective Murray and King. William King and Antonio Murray were 2 former Baltimore Police Department officers sentenced to a total of 454 years in prison after an FBI investigation in 2005. The conviction of King and Murray came about due to the work of the Baltimore-based Stop Snitching campaign, in which these 2 officers were identified on video as actually being involved in drug dealing. Now there's Officer John Torres. In 2008, Officer Torres shot and killed another officer by the name of Norman Stamp. In 2014, approximately 6 years later now, mind you, Norman Stamp had been killed earlier by John Torres, but it took the internal investigation, it took some other outside agency to get involved to finally arrest Torres 6 years later for attempted murder of Officer Norman Stamp. At that time, 2008, the Baltimore Police Department had been accused of a cover-up. So the things that I'm talking about when I tell you about a cover-up with the Freddie Gray case is not beyond belief, because the department has a systemic problem with covering for their officers, in many cases, falsifying departmental reports, holding back on investigations that should be investigated much sooner. There's no reason for an incident that happened to one of the departmental members to take 6 years to be investigated, to finally come to a conclusion that the officer who they suspected from the very beginning was also involved 6 years later. So there's an issue with that. But there's a culture that has permeated the department for years, even beyond before 2000. But I'm just giving you highlights from 2000 because there's a lot to cover. There's a lot of information that I can give you. Okay, so we'll move on from there. Then there was Officer Salvatore Rivera. This was a police officer who came to national attention. Okay, this was covered by the national media. in 2008 following the release of 2 videos depicting 2 separate instances of him verbally assaulting and manhandling citizens. And these were juveniles that the officer was accused of manhandling. We'll move on from there. Okay, and let's look at the as a result of this particular internal investigation. He was convicted internally. No, he was cleared internally of excessive force and discourtesies, but he was convicted on administrative charges of failing to write a report. The panel recommended that he be suspended for 5 days, but Commissioner Befield disagreed and he fired him. Very good, Commissioner Befield. I look at not writing a report is just as bad as writing and lying on a report. Because when you don't even write a report, you're saying that the incident never occurred, it never existed, and it gives the person who's making the complaint no win because there's no record of a report ever being filed. Anthony Fatter. In January 2011, Detective Anthony Fatter reported he had been shot in the parking lot structure near police headquarters. And on 2013 was convicted of various charges of benefits fraud because he shot himself. Daniel G. Redd, 2011. Daniel G. Redd, he was arrested for drug trafficking. While on trial, Redd had admitted to being involved in the process to distribute heroin. Redd was believed to be the first Baltimore officer charged in drug trafficking since William King and Antonio Murray, where charged were shaking down drug suspects. Now this is 2011. Shaking down drug suspects and then selling the drugs themselves. Both of these officers received life in federal prison. Redd was sentenced to 20 years in custody in September of 2012. This was a big one. I remember this. This was the Majestic towing scandal in 2012. This was on Befield's watch, Commissioner Befield's watch. He directed a team that included agents from the FBI that used wiretaps and other techniques to break up a major corruption scandal centered on the Majestic Auto Body Shop. Basically, the shop paid the Baltimore officers a fee, kind of a finder's fee, if you will, excuse me, where these officers would call Majestic Towing Company at the scene of accidents, and Majestic would give them a kickback to that individual officer who happened to call them to the scene to have these cars towed away. So that was a scandal. 17 officers pled guilty. Listen to this now. 17 officers pleaded guilty to the charges, but at least another 37 were also involved. I keep using. I won't go back to what I said earlier about the 1,500 patrol officers. At any given time, there's 1,500 officers assigned to patrol in the city of Baltimore. There's 9 different districts. So when you look at incidences where you have a multitude of officers, 17, that's a hell of a conspiracy. Then you talk about another 37 officers were involved. Another hell of a conspiracy. You're talking about 37, 7, and 14. You're talking about 54 officers involved in a conspiracy. Okay? So when you look at that number, when you hear police commissioners around the country talking about there a few bad apples in the barrel, a few officers are doing this type of behavior, well, I'd have to disagree, because anytime you can have almost 50 some odd officers in an area who've conspired with one another to shut up, to hide information, to lie to investigators, and take money, it goes beyond just a few bad apples. And I'll get into that more, because the statistics don't weigh heavy in favor of the Baltimore City making that claim that only a few bad apples, because there's quite a few bad apples within the department. Many of these bad apples have gone uninvestigated, paperwork destroyed over the years, transferred. Many of them were forced to resign. These are the things that you don't hear about, these forced resignations from a lot of police officers, what they call administrative stuff, where you can resign as long as you don't make a fuss about having to ask to leave the department. And technically speaking, you can actually go to another department, and when they call back to do a background investigation on you, by law, if you were asked to resign for personal reasons, if you will, that's all they have to report back to that agency is that, yeah, he used to or she used to work for us, but in fact, they resigned for personal reasons 4 years ago. And the investigating agency, the new department, would probably be fine with that because, you know, they've got somebody that they don't really have to train that much. You know, they'll probably have to go through the academy, but they have bringing somebody with some experience to the force, not knowing about this individual's background because he was asked to resign, and he resigned for personal reasons. All right, let me get off of the Majestic towing scandal. Then you had Lamin Manic, an officer in 2013, was indicted on charges he was acting as a pimp for his own wife and another woman. And in November 2014, he was convicted of that. 2013, James Walton Smith, Officer Smith, shot and killed himself while in custody, waiting trial for murder of his girlfriend. Kendall Richburg. In October 2013, Officer Kendall Richburg was sentenced to 8 years in prison on one count of charges. He pled guilty of conspiring with a local drug dealer. The officer would protect the dealer from arrest, would in turn provide information to Richburg to easily arrest them. Christopher Robinson, Officer Robinson, shot and killed his ex-girlfriend and her new partner before killing his own self. Officer Ashley Roan, in November 2013, Officer Roan pled guilty to charges related to a scheme to sell Social Security numbers. She had admitted to using official computers to access personal information, which she then passed on to others who could use that information to defraud the federal government or local government. She also admitted to protecting persons she thought were transporting large amounts of heroin in the city. In February 2014, she was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Frederick Allen, Wesley Cagle. Officer Wesley Cagle, who shot Michael Johnson in 2013 in the groin, was fired from the department after it was determined that he was already under custody by two other officers who had shot Mr. Cagle during a burglary. And after he was secured by the first two officers, it was reported that Officer Cagle came in the door while the suspect was laying on the ground and turned around and fired one .45 caliber shot in his groin. So he was fired. Frederick Allen, 2014. In 2014, Officer Allen pleaded guilty to 2 counts of sexual abuse of a minor. Then the abuse started when the abuse started in 2005, the girl was 15. She was working with the Police Athletic League, PAL. And Allen was fired subsequently from the department. 2014 again, Alec Eugene Taylor. In August of 2014, Officer Alec Eugene Taylor pled guilty to a felony animal cruelty. He killed his girlfriend's puppy. Okay, we bring it closer to these dates and times here with 2015. Major scandal that all of you all were familiar with across the nation had to do with the in-custody death of Freddie Gray, the one I've been reporting my videos on in video number 1 that dealt with the investigation, and video number 2. Video number 1 deals with the investigation and cover-up. Video number 2 deals with the medical examiner's report. And this is video 3. And again, I'm not necessarily talking about the Freddie Gray case today, but I'm giving you a historical breakdown of how a police department can unravel and get to the point that you have major incidences, national incidences, that illuminate serious problems with the police department. And as we know, all of this was illuminated in the Department of Justice report. So the things that I'm telling you now, certainly there's no need for me to fabricate or make any of this up. This is all documented stuff right here in paperwork. If you take the time to read the Department of Justice report, you'd almost want to pack your bags and move out of Baltimore City. Unbelievable. Some of the nonsense that was allowed to take place in that department over the years that it took place. So I'm going to continue on to 2015 when we talk about the 6 police officers who were arrested in the Western District dealing with the Freddie Gray case. And those names, if you remember, were Officer Goodson, who was a van driver, Lieutenant Rice, Officer Porter, Sergeant White, Officer Nero, and Officer Miller were the 6 officers that were originally charged in that case, and subsequently all officers were either found not guilty or prosecution did not want to continue any more prosecutions, and then subsequently they were found not guilty. Okay, so those were the 2015 incidents that led to the major riot in Baltimore City. Now, while all this was going on, while all this major stuff was going on back in 2015, you have several members of the gun squad who had the audacity. Not only was the Freddie Gray incident going on at that time, but you had the Department of Justice here in Baltimore City doing a major investigation or audit on the police department. And these several officers had the nerve to continue to break the law, not only state law, city law, but federal law as well. So this goes to show you the blatant disregard for rules of law in general. I mean, just out and out, just, well, we want to do what we want to do, and whatever happens, happens. Well, it did happen. They got caught. So you had 8 gun squad officers that were involved. So it goes like this. You had Officer Gondo, Officer Hendricks, Officer Herschel, Officer Jenkins, Raham, Officer Taylor, and Officer Ward. And you had another officer, I don't have his name off of hand, but he was just a sergeant. He was just indicted by the feds. So that's total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 officers involved in that investigation. 2 of the officers, as you know, have already pled guilty because they certainly don't want to go to jail for life through the feds. All the officers are charged with the RICO statute. The RICO statute basically is a conspiracy statute under 18 U.S.C. subsection 1962D. And then you have the RICO statute 18 U.S.C. 1962R, aiding and abetting, and then you have 18 U.S.C. subsection 2, criminal forfeiture, and 18. You have 21 U.S.C. subsection 855. Again, all of these indictments are federal indictments that come from the United States District Court in the District of Maryland. With these officers here. Okay, now I've given you the most, let's say, noteworthy cases, media-made cases since 2000. But, you know, I can add in some more cases. You know, we can add in a couple of cases that dealt with, I don't have the officer's name, I'm sorry, but this officer was off duty. He was drinking, and he ended up killing a man, a former Marine. I'm a former Marine, so I take issue with that. He actually point blank shot a Marine 8 times in the chest for no reason at all, and subsequently he pled guilty and went to jail for the rest of his life. That's an incident that made the newspapers. It just wasn't the ones that I covered. But if you think about the thousands of complaints that citizens made in Baltimore over the past 20 years, and you think about the ones that were cleared, the ones that weren't cleared, the ones that paperwork was thrown away, we certainly could have had a lot more. It is my estimation, based on national numbers, because that's what we do here. We do in advanced criminology. We look at the numbers. We go back and look at statistics. We go back and look at reports. We go back and look at anything that deals with criminology. And we look and compare and contrast different things from different agencies across the board. And we look at what's going on in those police departments. And unfortunately, Baltimore stands out as one of the departments that, among a couple others, that had major issues, structural issues, as well as cultural issues within their department. And it's you know, a lot of people say, well, you know, it starts down with the bottom with the officers who basically this department had problems from the top of the head all the way down. From the top of the head all the way down. One of the problems that we came away with when we did our research was that on average, over the past 20 years, Baltimore has only been able to have a police commissioner for about 2.5 years. That's it. 2.5 years on average in terms of running the show. If this was a for-profit company being run for money, for business, they probably would have went under a long time ago, because no successful business that I know of changes so many CEOs without running into problems, because policy is implemented over and over again by someone new. And you never get a chance to find out what works because you're not there long enough to see what works. So one of the major issues that I've found is that by changing the commissioners over and over again, on average, again, 2.5 years, the only commissioner out of that 20 years that stayed longer on average than 2.5 years was Commissioner Fred Beefield. You know, he stayed 5-6 years and then he decided, to get out of there and retire. So kudos to him for staying as long as he did. But when you look at the other commissioners, they really had no vested interest in seeing that things went well within the police department. So, I'll leave it at that. I could go on and on and on about that, but I'm in this video 26 minutes already and haven't really gotten to what I want to talk about. Okay, so I've touched on those things dealing with the definitions of police corruption and misconduct from the very beginning of the video. We spoke about some highlighted incidents, cases that you might know or may not know, and that dealt with police corruption and misconduct. One of the things that, and now I'm going to focus my attention to the report conducted by the Department of Justice. Now, when you hear some of the things I talk about, just keep in mind about the Freddie Gray investigation and the Freddie Gray incidents surrounding Freddie Gray's death. And you'll start to see that there's a pattern of practice and behavior within the department that, quite frankly, you probably could have had a lot more of Freddie Gray's. And you probably did have some people who died in custody that probably shouldn't have died in custody because of excessive force. One of the things that was pointed out, and I'm going to go back to this report on page 46. I'll always give you the page number, that way if you want to refer to it, it's online. You can refer to it yourself, dealing with the DOJ. I think even the police department's website might have a PDF that you can download and take a look at it. But one of the issues that struck me as quite interesting was on page 46, and it was discussion from the investigators from DOJ who said that for several years the state's attorney's office maintained what they call a do not call list of officers that the prosecutors should not subpoena or testify, because it had been determined that these officers do not testify credibly about their enforcement actions. Basically, they're saying that they lie every time they come to court. Although the state's attorney's office regularly shared the list with the Baltimore Police Department, the department rarely used the information to identify officers who may need support or discipline. Now, I would say that the state's attorney's office did their job. They notified the police department, look, we have problems with these guys. They're on a do not call list. How in the hell can you possibly enforce and can get people convicted in this city if you have police officers that the state's attorney's office won't even call to the stand? It's unbelievable. How can you manage crime? How can you manage your police officers if in fact there is no, if you don't enforce the rules against your police for lying in the courtroom? It's unbelievable. And the state's attorney's right. They can't take information from police officers that's been tainted, that's been lied about, and turn around and prosecute somebody for information they may or may not believe because the officer's been shown in the past to be untruthful. So it makes sense. And it's not their job to sit there and correct and notify the police department every time somebody lies. They just compiled a list and said, look, we're sending you a list. These are the guys. They need to be called in, and you handle it departmentally the way you want to handle it. And apparently it didn't happen because same officers were coming back and forth to court. Same officers were locking up people, fabricating testimony, stories. So there was a pattern even then. Okay? And I didn't discover it. DOJ did. So in recent years, the state's attorney's office has contacted BPD leadership on several occasions to identify officers that prosecutors determined that can no longer testify credibility due to misconduct. And in most of these cases, they're saying the BPD leadership took no action to identify the problem officers. Let me tell you something from being on the street for the years I was on the street. If you do not call officers in to discipline officers, then those officers continue to do the same thing over and over and over again, because there's no checks and balances in place, and they know it's no checks and balances in place. Subsequently, they have a free rein to do whatever they want to do in the field. And so when they get caught up and something happens during the arrest where a suspect dies, now the police department has to backpedal, because in their minds, they're thinking that this officer is doing a hell of a job. But this officer has never been disciplined before. It's probably, his name has probably come up in the department, in roll call. His name has come up in that district. His name has come up in criminal investigation division. His name has come up in some of these specialized units, as we saw with the case with the gun officers. I'll get back to this in just a second, but I personally have talked to officers who are retired from the department now, who are working in sheriff's department now from Baltimore City, who work in other agencies around the state now. I've talked to some of these officers, and some of these officers have told me that the recent officers who just got locked up in the gun squad had been doing what they call street rips early on, several years earlier, and taking money and drugs off of people then. Even then, several years earlier. So the phenomena of 2015, 2016, where we finally get the feds to step in because they finally have cases that they can investigate and really close out under the RICO statute, these same officers quite naturally should spend probably the rest of their life under the jail, because they were doing these same types of things and same types of behavior before the indictments even came out, long before they even started the investigation. So there had been a pattern and practice and an acceptability by commanders, by sergeants, lieutenants who run the shows with street officers, that this was okay. And that since as long as nobody's telling each other, nobody's talking, you know, and we're effectively on the street, quote unquote, taking people off the street who present a problem and a threat to the citizens of Baltimore because, quote unquote, they were allegedly handling firearms, when in fact they weren't. Even if you look at if they did a phenomenal job of taking guns off the street, it still didn't have crime decline in the city of Baltimore. It's been proven already. I don't have to prove it. There was researchers at University of Maryland who proved that. So the stats are already there. See, the stats, if we can rely on the stats are there to show that the crime rate had dropped, but the crime rate was dropping anyway. It had nothing to do with the guys with the guns. The homicide rate was still going up. So if the goal was to take the guns off the street to reduce homicides, it didn't work. What we created was a culture within a culture of the police department, something I talked about years ago when I first started studying criminal justice. This was back in the 80s when I was just a young guy going through community college in Baltimore. And I had a professor that talked about how you can have several cultures within the police department that operate on their own without any or little bit of oversight. And that's what happened in the case dealing with the Majestic towing scandal. It happened in the recent scandal with the officers in the gun squad. Okay, so they were operating with what they call impunity. And so that's what happened. I'll keep going on, and I want to get down to page 67. Page 67 of this report talks about BPD misclassifies and fails to investigate complaints of racial slurs and racial bias, allowing a culture of bias. You'll hear me use the word culture because that's kind of like the go-to word when you're dealing with police departments, that there's a culture. Even in private business, there's a culture that exists, and everybody works within a framework of that culture, where oftentimes policies and practices oftentimes collide and are not effectively followed And sometimes sometimes nothing is followed. But because after a while from not being followed, it becomes what? A practice. That's the way we do it. That's the way we're used to doing it. And this is why you'll hear when young officers come out the academy and they're assigned to their districts for the first time, whether they're working with the first time working by themselves in the car or working with the squad, you'll hear the young officers say, well, this is what they taught me at the academy. And then you'll hear the older seasoned officers say, look, forget all the crap they taught you in the academy. None of that is going to apply out here in the street. The problem is that it can all apply in the street if you know what you're doing and if you take the time to learn what you learned in the academy and use it to your benefit when you're working on the street. Period. The fact that an officer comes and tells another officer, look, I don't care what they told you in the academy, this is how we police in this particular area. Well, that's because it's been a practice that has culminated into a culture of doing things the way you want to. And as a result of that, you have riots in the streets now in Baltimore City. You have a multitude of lawsuits that tax the city over $12 million. You have officer shootings. You have officers, at least 20, on any given day in any courtroom, you'll find 20 to 25% of testimony from officers in this city to be fabricated. So these are the things that breed that kind of culture. So let me get back to the complaint statement. I just want to highlight a couple of these. It said the city paid out $95,000 in 2012 to settle a lawsuit brought by an 87-year-old African-American woman, grandmother, who was shoved against the wall after she refused to let an officer enter her basement to conduct what? A warrantless search. After shoving the woman to the floor, the officer allegedly stood over her and called her a bitch and said, you ain't no better than these old black bitches I've locked up. Well, you know, for that bitch word, the city paid out $95,000 to her. 2014, a middle-aged African-American man sued the sergeant in Southeast Baltimore who stopped him in Patterson Park, did a strip search of him in public. When the man protested, he said he would get a lawyer. The sergeant told him, go get your nigga ass out of here. BPD found the complaint not sustained without interviewing any of the involved parties, meaning that the complaint was filed, but they didn't go. The internal investigation affairs didn't even go out to talk to people. Again, that's a culture, okay, where you start getting complaints, and because in your mind as an investigator, internal investigator, you say to them, oh, we've had these types of complaints before. They don't mean anything. So you sit on your behinds in the office, collect a taxpayer check every 2 weeks, mind you, and you don't go out in the field to at least make the attempt. Okay, even if you don't believe it, at least make the attempt to go out and talk to other people to find out whether or not this particular citizen was telling the truth, particularly if he had witnesses. That makes sense. Another case is one Baltimore firefighter and an emergency medical tech told the Department of Justice, had an interview with the Department of Justice now, that prior to a march led by a prominent African-American pastor in 2015, a Baltimore police officer told the firefighters that were there on location that they're ready to go marching and I think there's going to be a problem. So what you all should do is turn the hoses on them. Okay. 2013, a white male BPD officer made racially charged threat to an African-American teenager while booking the youth in the facility, as the youth was talking about George Zimmerman and Tavon Martin case. When the case was investigated, the incident, the officer admitted to talking about the crabs and throwing him in the river, but claimed to internal affairs that he could not recall whether he made a remark about a hoodie. BPD sustained a complaint against the officer for misconduct and making inappropriate conduct, but the investigator found, mind you now, the Department of Justice came in looking through files and everything in this 9-month investigation period, and they came in and they were looking for these reports. And it says here that the investigative file contains no record of discipline of this particular officer, meaning that they said he did it. They confirmed by saying that they sustained the complaint against him for making that inappropriate comment. But if he made an inappropriate comment, the Department of Justice wants to know, well, what did you all do to the officer? Well, there's no record of anything being done to the officer. And they found hundreds of those types of issues. Okay. And again, it gets back to the historical methodology and culture created by not disciplining officers the first time around. You don't even get to several officers in the gun squad, at least a couple of them that I know of. They don't even get to the gun squad. They don't even get to the point where they're doing these types of things, because the types of things that I heard they were doing prior to them going in the gun squad, they would have been fired back then, had it been investigated. Page 68. It says here that BPD fails to record complaints of racial biases and misclassifies complaints to mask their racial components. Okay. BPD also fails to investigate allegations of bias enforcement. By not using its own procedures to deter and correct biased conduct, BPD exacerbates the relationships between Baltimore African American communities, because numerous individuals that were interviewed by DOJ told the BPD when they were told of the police department their complaints, the police department either refused to accept their complaints for egregious racially motivated conduct or did not take the complaints seriously. And many communities thus feel that BPD is biased against African American and does not respond to their concerns. Page 92. And I want to talk about this because we talk about this deals with foot pursuits. BPD uses excessive force against individuals who are fleeing from them, and the tactics that endanger themselves and the community members. The DOJ basically said that BPD officers use excessive force against individuals during foot pursuits. Once engaged in a foot pursuit, BPD officers then often use force to end the pursuit regardless of whether they had only reasonable suspicion to conduct a stop or probable cause to make an arrest. They also indicated that the Terry stop becomes so disproportionate to the purpose of such a stop in light of surrounding circumstances, and the purpose may include ensuring the safety of officers and others, then the encounter becomes a formal arrest. It says often the force officers used to end the pursuit was disproportional to the suspected crime. Okay, that's disproportional. That's important. It says here officers' force used to end the pursuit was disproportional to the suspected crime and the threat posed by the civilian. We'll go back to Freddie Gray now for a second. The testimony would have been from the officers up on North Avenue that they observed Freddie Gray. He made eye contact. Now, Officer Miller never says that he saw a shiny object in Gray's waistband. There's a lieutenant that says he saw an object in Gray's waistband, but the lieutenant never gave foot pursuit. Officer Miller just testified that Gray made contact, and then when they approached Officer Gray and Devontae Rory, those two individuals that they chased, both of them started to run. As I said in the other video, the second video, that the reason that Devontae Rory ran is because Officer Miller had locked him up a month earlier for narcotics violations. So even if the testimony by the officer is that, which was never articulated, by the way, I locked Devontae up because I just had a prior run-in with him with narcotics last month. He made eye contact with me, so I said, let me approach him because I know for a fact this guy is known to sell drugs up here on North Avenue. But we don't have that information because that information did not come out until after the trial was over with. And so what you get is officers stopping people, and that's what they said, that where the circumstances did not dictate certain stops, and so they were disproportionate to the force used. So they gave chase, in this case, Freddie Gray. Basically, you stopped Freddie Gray, you chased Freddie Gray because he looked at you, and you never articulated why. And after you caught up with Freddie Gray and slammed him to the ground, broke his neck, subsequently to the arrest, you recover what is known as a pocket knife. For those of you who don't know how it works in the police department in Baltimore City, for years we were doing the same thing back in the 80s, where we'd pull up on a corner, people take off running. It's a known drug corner, and you start chasing somebody, and you end up catching them. But because you never really developed any probable cause to actually chase them from the very beginning, you end up patting them down and searching them, and you come up with drugs, you come up with a knife, you come up with a gun, those types of things. So it's called search incident to an arrest, but it's technically search incident to a lawful arrest. So if you never have reasonable suspicion that you can articulate that a person is committing a crime in your presence, and you don't articulate that in the very beginning, and you give chase to somebody, and all of a sudden you luck up and you recover a weapon or you recover drugs, technically speaking, the case can be thrown out. I'm just giving you the kind of like the layman's way of looking at it, you know, not necessarily all the legal ramifications behind it. And so that's what was happening. But that's a culture that continued to this day. To this day, the same culture continued, and I didn't have to say it. It was pointed out by the Department of Justice, who reviewed thousands of reports, who talked to hundreds of people, and it came back that it was just too many Fourth Amendment violations in this city to even think about. The numbers weren't, the department didn't even have quantifiable numbers. They stopped taking numbers after a while. So you get to the point where Freddie Gray's killed. Whether it was before or whether it was in the van, you know, my take has always been on the first two videos that the folks I work with and some professional people at different universities around the country, we've all come away with a different take, that we believe that Freddie Gray was stomped to death in that courtyard. We subsequently were able to show that there was subsequent actions, initial actions by Officer Miller in that courtyard to warrant further investigation, as well as to make a determination as to what injuries Freddie Gray's injuries sustained to his neck, which caused him to die. So if you look at what he's allegedly supposed to have been doing and done, it didn't require him to die over a pocket knife, because he never had any drugs on him, didn't have anything but a pocket knife. So you know, and these are the things that DOJ is pointing out. Okay, I'm going to page 108. And this is interesting. DOJ also found significant differences between the practices when interviewing witnesses and its practices when interviewing officers that suggest a bias in favor of the officer. For example, when interviews of the officers finally did occur, they were conclusory and superficial, often lasting no longer than 10 or 15 minutes, and some ending in 5 minutes. Meaning that when Internal Affairs talked to the guys, they basically said, look, tell us what happened. And they said, okay, we got it, and that was it, and the officers were out of there. Take the same investigators who now talking to citizens who were making that report, might be there for an hour or two, while Internal Affairs is grilling them as to what they think they heard, what they think they saw, okay, and what they think the officer did or didn't do. For example, they use, in 2013 shooting, the Internal Affairs detective interview of the shooting officer lasted only 5 minutes. In other words, this officer who shot his weapon was only interviewed 5 minutes. And that included form questions about the nature of the interview, which were not particular to the facts of the case. So he asked them questions, pre-arranged questions in this interview. They were form questions that weren't even relevant to the case. The actual substantive interview, the actual interview of the officer, only lasted 3 minutes. PPD's interview of the civilians and witnesses, on the other hand, in the same case in 2013, lasted hours, and the investigators asked specific probing questions, demonstrating their ability to be thorough and exacting. They also found that the Baltimore Police Internal Affairs had a practice of conducting what they call pre-interviews with officers before turning on the recording devices in interview rooms. The pre-interviews with officers were aimed at asking officers off the record questions that they would be using on the record. So For example, in 2013, officer-involved shooting, an investigator from Internal Affairs stated, "Sir, please, just as we did before we went on the tape, just tell us what happened." So he's saying that this was discussed before the taping even began. They said the officer then prepared a canned and prepared presentation about a shooting, summarizing the incident from beginning to end. The interview on tape lasts only 8 minutes. According to the investigators from the Department of Justice, they said pre-interviews impede the integrity of the investigation. Because of this, pre-interview investigations of officer-involved shootings have been discouraged since the early 1990s. Okay, not in the Baltimore Police Department have they been discouraged. They're just telling you overall that they have been discouraged by the Department of Justice. Okay. The investigative deficiencies prevent BPD from being able to evaluate whether officers who use deadly force faced an immediate threat or serious harm, and whether their force was justified. Moreover, by failing to critically evaluate the officer's tactics and decision-making prior to the use of deadly force, including opportunities to de-escalate, the department fails to help officers improve their skills and potentially decrease the need to resort to deadly force. To effectively oversee the use of this force, BPD must take steps to remedy these deficiencies. And that's what the Department of Justice says. And when I read that whole scenario, because I just want you to think back that in this Freddie Gray case, there's also an interview of Officer Miller by Internal Affairs. And I swear to you, what I have here highlighted in this DOJ, dealing with interviews by Internal Affairs with police officers, is to the point. If you take a look at that interview, you can go back and look at it under the Baltimore City Sun paper website, and just go look up, type in Officer Miller interview. It lasts a few minutes. There's even some discussions of there was a conversation with the officer prior to them going on tape. That's how, it is. I mean, that's how wide open that it is in that department, that we can pretty much prepare you before we do an actual interview with you on record. And the reason, let's face it, the reason that you do it is so that you can cover all the bases to protect that particular officer. If you don't want he or she saying something that can incriminate them, that's now been taped, okay, and can be used as evidence later at a trial. And that's the whole reason why it's done that way. Okay, I want to go to okay, I'm going to stop it here. I've covered it out almost 53 minutes, which is an hour that dealt with police corruption. And I will tell you, this hour is nothing. I could literally sit down for, I don't know if I can talk that long, but I could probably sit down for another 2 hours and really get into the breaking down of the DOJ summary report of the problems in the police department. But it would take me a long time. And I only took out things to highlight because those things are important. I'm going to go ahead and shut this video down for now. This is now video 3, which deals with police corruption and misconduct within the Baltimore City Police Department. I'll be putting together video 4, and I will probably go back to the actual investigation and some of the cover-up stuff within the investigation itself. Thank you.